My name is Amos Guiora, and I'm the director of the Institute for Global Security Law and Policy at Case Law School. On behalf of the Institute and the Law School, welcome to this great event. Today's conference is sponsored and supported by the Roe Green Foundation. Roe Green and her family have been friends of the law school for many years. Roe is with us today, and I would like to extend a warm and very special welcome to you, Roe. As you may know, her father, the late Judge Ben C. Green, was a graduate of Western Reserve School of Law from the class of 1930 and the first alumnus of our school appointed to the federal bench. He was chosen by President Kennedy to serve as a judge of the United States District Court for the Northern District of Ohio, a post he held with distinction for 20 years. Like her father was in the past, Roe was a member of the Society of Benchers at the law school, which honors alumni and friends of the law school for their outstanding contributions to the legal profession, their communities, and our school. Since the establishment of the Judge Ben C. Green Visiting Professorship in 1989, the family of Judge Green has enriched the law school experience for our students by bringing top scholars to the campus. Thanks to a substantial gift by Roe and her late mother, Sylvia Green, the visiting professorship was converted into a fully funded chaired professorship in 1999, a position that has been held by Professor Kevin McMonigal. Kevin? Following in the footsteps of her parents, Roe has continued to be a wonderful supporter of the law school. Most recently, during our Leading the Way in Legal Education fundraising campaign, Roe gave the law school the largest outright single gift it has ever received. Our renovated library, the Judge Ben C. Green Law Library, is named in her father's honor as a result. I warmly invite all of you during the course of the day at breaks to go visit the library. It is truly an amazing thing. Just this past month, we presented the Judge Ben C. Green Distinguished Lecture in Law, another of Roe's initiatives to honor her father and support the school. Her support of this conference is further proof that the generosity of the family of one of our finest alumnus truly continues. Roe, please stand to be recognized. On behalf of the law school and the Institute, I thank you for your continued support and true friendship.
My name is Jessie Hill. I'm an assistant professor here at the law school. And I just wanted to also welcome you and give you a brief background on how this conference came about. This conference had its origins actually in a series of very informal conversations over coffee or lunch among Professor Guiora and myself of the law school, Professors Timothy Beale and William Deal of the Religious Studies Department, and Reverend John Lentz of Forest Hill Church, about the relationship, if any, between religion and terrorism. We were all very interested in just discussing this topic. These informal meetings developed into a series of roundtable events in the late 2005 among scholars and practitioners from a variety of disciplines, which in turn formed the basis for the planning of today's conference. The goal has always been to hold an interdisciplinary conference with an innovative format and a unique purpose, namely, to find out whether the views of scholars who have been thinking about the problem of religiously based terrorism from a variety of different perspectives and disciplines, like religion, philosophy, psychology, political science, might have anything to teach, or what they might have to teach those of us who focus more on law and policy and have been thinking about this issue from a law and policy perspective, in the hopes of developing new solutions to this very current, but at the same time, very ancient problem. Admittedly, this is a very ambitious project, but I have no doubt that our esteemed panelists today are up to the task. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Professor Gordon to introduce our panelists. Thanks.
Before Richard. Sorry. Technical items. There is an overflow room, which is room 159.
Room A58.
A58. I stand corrected, Nancy. For those who are in the overflow room, note that when you see short video clips, You will see and hear the clips, but you won't see the conference participants. That's point number one. Point number two, when the participants use they're talking, you cannot see the speaker. You can hear the speaker, can't see the speaker. Next request, please, if you have not yet turned off your cell phones, iPods, webcasting, SMSing, text messages, whatever else is out there, please turn off all gadgets. Everybody all at once. All participants, please use a microphone when you talk, because that's the only way that those who are listening, both in the overflow room and in the webcast, can actually hear you. Also, please note that we run a tight schedule here. We have a number of important speakers, and when we say that there's a 15-minute break, 15 minutes is 15 minutes. Don't laugh. With that out of the way, the following is a short video clip to set the stage for some of the issues to be discussed during the course of this conference. This video is a message from the President to the experts assembled to be part of a mock White House task force. Although the video alludes to a fictional religious group, the intent of this conference is to discuss the very real issue of religious extremism both in the United States and abroad.
You were given this document. It's not clear who composed it. Can you tell us who composed this thing?
Dr. Hussein. Dr. Hussein. One of the participants.
Oh, is this a person in the law school?
No, one of the people we invite for law.
Welcome to the briefing room. Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States speaking to you from the White House.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming today. I have asked you all here to help us address a problem of growing concern. Our country needs your expertise to better understand how some religious groups turn to violence and how we can together address this phenomenon. American intelligence agents have been monitoring several groups here in the United States who promote violence against non-believers. Specifically, agents are focused on a group calling themselves the Samists. This group is of particular concern because of their strict adherence to the Samist doctrine, and among some of the members, a belief that any means, including extreme violence, are justified to further their cause. I asked you here today because I want your insight to analyze and address this growing concern. Again, thank you.
Good morning. Good morning. My name is Richard Gordon, and I'm a visiting professor here at the law school. Unfortunately, I am not President of the United States, so I apologize he couldn't be here. Our first two panels are going to address sort of the underlying issue here that we're discussing at the conference. It's really the roots and workings of terrorism. And we're going to have two panels. I'm going to be moderating the first one. And I'm just going to introduce the panelists. I'll introduce each panelist, then you'll speak, and then we'll have our question and answer period. Our first panelist, we don't know each other, but we have very close mutual friends, so I'm glad finally to meet you, Bill, including one of your classmates in your PhD program in religious studies at Harvard. Bill is the Inamori professor of ethics here, and I believe is the first director of the Inamori International Center for Ethics and Excellence. And we're very pleased to have this center here. As I knew before I even met you, Bill is an expert primarily in Japanese Buddhism, and I understand is quite fluent in Japanese. And his scholarship includes quite a bit of articles, chapters, and books, specifically on religion and ethics, and most particularly in Buddhism. And he's the co-author of the book Theory for Religious Studies and author of the Handbook to Life in Medieval and Early Modern Japan. So, Bill, I'll let you start.
Okay. Who do we know in common?
We'll discuss this later.
Uh-oh. Thank you very much. I want to thank Amos and Jessie as well for extending this invitation to speak. As you've just heard, my own area of expertise is Japanese religion and ethics. The issue of terrorism is a relatively new endeavor for me. I've been interested in issues of religious violence, but it seems to me that religious violence and terrorism are not necessarily the same thing, and I will address that a little bit today. But what I want to talk about today is a Japanese religious group that many of you probably know, Shinrikyo, and to talk about them in terms of terrorism in general, concepts of religious terrorism, just to throw this into the mix of the discussion that we're going to have this afternoon, all day today. During rush hour on the morning of March 20th, 1995, several high-ranking members of the Japanese religion called Shinrikyo, or in English, Om Supreme Truth, boarded cars in 3 of Tokyo's underground lines. They set plastic bags filled with sarin nerve gas on the floor of the cars, and just after 8 a.m., punctured them with the sharpened points of the umbrellas they carried. Sarin gas permeated the subway cars, and as the trains stopped at stations along their routes, gas also escaped into the subway stations. This event has come to be known in Japan as the Chikatetsu Sarin Jiken, or the subway sarin gas incident. It resulted in the death of 12 people, both passengers and subway company employees, and it injured several thousand people, many permanently. If any of you have seen this book by Japanese, usually a novelist, Haruki Murakami, who also writes essays, there's a book it's translated into English, it's called Underground, and it's some incredibly evocative stories about what happened to people on this day. Although there was immediate suspicion when all of this happened, when there was immediate suspicion cast on Shinrikyo as the likely perpetrators of this act, there was no specific proof to definitively tie members of the religion to this crime. Was suspected in part because of incidents occurring the previous year. In June 1994, 7 people died from the effects of exposure to sarin gas in Matsumoto, a city in Nagano Prefecture where had facilities. Similarly, in July of 1994, the small village of Kamikuishiki in Yamanashi Prefecture was the site of complaints about foul-smelling odors emanating from an unknown source. Testing by authorities revealed derivatives of sarin gas in the soil. Shinrikyo also had facilities in this locality, and later authorities came to find out that the sarin gas that was used in the Tokyo subway system was produced at this location. More specific proof tying to the Tokyo subway attack came later in 1995 when an Shinrikyo member was arrested on charges stemming from a completely different matter. But in his deposition to police, he implicated Asahara Shoko, Ohm's leader, as the person behind the sarin gas attack. On May 16, 1995, Asahara and 41 other Ohm members were arrested on suspicion of direct or indirect involvement in the subway sarin gas incident. Among those arrested, Asahara and 12 others were charged with murder or attempted murder, and in February 2004, Asahara was sentenced to death for these crimes. Now, the reaction of the Japanese government and the Japanese media to the subway sarin gas incident was immediate. Responses ranged from outrage to horror to disbelief that such an event could happen in Japan. Troubling, too, for many was the calculated choice of subway lines used in the attack. All 3 lines stop at Kasumigaseki, a subway station located in close proximity to many of Japan's central government offices in downtown Tokyo. Although Japanese citizens had been associated with terrorist acts in the past, the most notorious, of course, being the Japanese Red Army, these activities had been largely conducted outside of Japan. Until March 20th, 1995, Japanese domestic terrorism of this significance was unknown. Perhaps even more frightening was the fact, subsequently revealed, that scientists had created enough sarin gas to kill as many as 4 million people. As deadly as the subway sarin gas incident had been, the potential for wide-scale murder existed, and many Japanese left were left with the anxiety that such potential might yet be realized. In the aftermath of the Tokyo subway attack, it was the media that largely crafted the image we have of Ome Shinrikyo today. Important Japanese news sources such as the Asahi Shimbun, the Kyoto News Service, the Japan Times, and the Mainichi Shimbun referred to Ome as a cult. They referred to them as a doomsday cult, as a violent new religion, or simply sometimes as a criminal organization. If you look at the Japanese media, only sparingly has it referred to Ome as a terrorist organization, though this designation is regularly used by Japanese media to report on events in Iraq, Afghanistan, violence between Palestine and Israel, and in reporting on September 11th. So the notion of terrorism is certainly a part of the Japanese public discourse, but it really hasn't been used about Ome Shinrikyo. I might also add, just as a sidebar here, that the word that is often used in Japan for terrorism is the word tero, which is just simply an abbreviation of the English word terrorism. So there is no indigenous Japanese word that is regularly used to represent the concept of terrorism. Like the Japanese media, the U.S. media also painted vivid images of Ome Shinrikyo and its actions. The New York Times, in its first articles after the attack, but prior to revelations about Ome's involvement in the subway sarin gas incident, frequently used the term terrorist attack to describe the events in Tokyo. The terms terrorist attack and terrorism largely dropped out of the Times' stories as evidence mounted against Ome. Instead, the Times focused on Ome itself and variously described this religious organization as a cult, or as a sect, or as a religious sect. And the Times apparently sees these terms as synonymous because they are sometimes interchanged in the same article. Now, although the Times used the word terror to describe the way that some people felt as a result of the attack, it did not, as far as I've been able to discover, call Ome a terrorist organization. Now, if the New York Times was moderately restrained in its reporting, other arguably respectable American news organizations were sometimes more overt and arguably sensationalist in crafting their image of this religious group, Ome Shinrikyo. Some of you may recall the Time magazine cover from April 1995 that had a picture of Asahara Shoko, the leader of Ome, and it's mostly just his face, so you cannot miss, sort of the impact of like looking at this figure. And the headline on the cover is, in big letters, of course, over his face, "Cult of Doom." And then the sub heading is, "A poison gas attack triggers fears about extremists using homemade weapons of mass death." I'm not exactly sure what the homemade part means, but that's an interesting concept. It does conjure up us in our bathrooms mixing chemicals, I guess. I think they were a lot more sophisticated than that. The photo caption reads, "Shoko Asahara, leader of the apocalyptic cult Ome Shinrikyo." Now, just encapsulated on the cover of this magazine is all sorts of incredibly emotionally laden terms that I want to try to unpack here a little bit as I go along this morning. Briefly, I wanted to say something about what were some of the government responses to Ome. To make a long story short, the Japanese government attempted to shut down Ome as a religious organization, but it did so not on the basis that Ome was a terrorist organization and therefore a threat to the Japanese nation, but rather on the grounds that it violated laws regulating the activities of officially recognized religious organizations. So the approach was that Ome had somehow gone against the rights it had been given as an officially recognized religious group. There's more we could say about that, but I'll leave that for later. other government responses, I really only have time here to cover that of the United States, but I think the United States response is also instructive. If you look, at least the last time I looked, the United States Department of State officially lists Aum Shinrikyo as one of 42 foreign terrorist organizations, or FTOs. Among the other organizations listed in this grouping of FTOs are such notable terrorist organizations as Abu Nidal, Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade, ETA, the Basque separatist movement, Hamas, Hezbollah, Islamic Jihad, the Tamil Tigers, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, Al-Qaeda, and Shining Path. So Aum is placed in pretty interesting company here if you think about this as a global phenomenon. Now, in order to be listed as a foreign terrorist organization, an organization must fit either the definition of what it means to, quote, engage in terrorist activity, end quote, or fit the definition of terrorism. As defined in the State Department documents, terrorism is, quote, premeditated, politically motivated violence perpetrated against non-combatant targets by subnational groups or clandestine agents, end quote. Terrorist activity, according to these documents, includes such things as the hijacking or sabotage of any conveyance, assassination, the use of any biological agent, chemical agent, or nuclear weapon or device, or explosive, firearm, or other weapons or dangerous device, other than for mere personal monetary gain. I think that's an interesting addition. With intent to endanger, directly or indirectly, the safety of one or more individuals or to cause substantial damage to property. Finally, a threat, attempt, or conspiracy to do any of the foregoing. So, depending on the sources that one reads, listens to, relies on, Aum Shinrikyo is either a terrorist organization, a cult, or both. Such descriptive license leaves us with powerful, though mostly stereotypical, images of who Aum Shinrikyo is or was as an organization and the actions it carried out. Aum Shinrikyo no longer exists, I should add, under the name Aum Shinrikyo. The remaining followers are under a term, they call themselves Aleph, A-L-E-P-H. Yeah, so they do still exist, but in a rather different configuration. Now, I think there's some context. Yeah, Aleph being, of course, the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet, which is interesting. That is the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet, right? What's interesting about that, actually, as a choice, is that the word Aum, of course, is from the Sanskrit, and Aum is the A sound is the first letter of the Sanskrit alphabet, and the sound is the last letter of the Sanskrit alphabet. Taken together, it's meant to encapsulate all of the sort of the sacred word of the universe. So it's a sacred term that encapsulates everything. So it's interesting that Aum, use the Sanskrit vocabulary. Now they've switched to another vocabulary with, I suppose, some sacred overtones as well. Some context. As I was thinking about trying to sort out some of these conceptual and definitional issues, it seemed to me that there was a lot of context here that would be worth exploring. We don't really have time this morning to do that, but I just wanted to say a couple of things about the context in which Aum Shinrikyo operated in Japan. In the first place, Aum Shinrikyo is usually described by scholars of Japanese religion as a new religion. We used to have just new religions, but now we have new religions. From a Japanese perspective, what this refers to is the fact that the new religions is a term that especially refers to the religions that arose in Japan after the end of World War II, when religious freedom was guaranteed by the Constitution that we wrote for the Japanese people. And so in this new era of religious freedom, there was the opportunity for all sorts of new religious movements to arise. In the 1970s, when this notion of the new religions comes into play, it presumably describes new developments in the practices and beliefs of these new Japanese religious movements. There's some contestation about how accurate this terminology is. But some of these new developments presumably refer to the idea of Japanese interests, or some of these Japanese religious groups having interest in, for example, psychic phenomena, an interest in ascetic practices and spirituality. They often attract younger adherents. The old new religions were really usually more about some sort of variation on Shinto or Buddhist ideas. One way you might think about this is that groups like Om, we might group them under the category of kind of New Age religion from a Western perspective. Violent, maybe, New Age religions, but New Age religions, nevertheless, they're rather eclectic and syncretic in what they do. And if we take a look at Om's religious practices, we find that they are a mix of Hinduism, esoteric Buddhism, which is affiliated with Tibetan Buddhism. There are all sorts of PR photos of Shoko Asahara with the Dalai Lama, who has, of course, repudiated him at this point. Their practices include various kinds of ascetic endeavors, including meditation, fasting, yoga, meant to lead to an enlightenment experience. There is an emphasis in Om, for historical reasons it's rather peculiar from a Japanese perspective, but an emphasis on the good of the spiritual world and the evil of the material world. It sounds a little bit like Gnostic religion in the West, if you think about it that way. One of the things that develops in Om as an organization is they begin to, in fact, enact violence against their own members who they see as falling out with the policies and the edicts that Asahara handed down. There's an incident of the murder of a lawyer who represented the disgruntled families of Om followers who were trying to get access to their children. Over time, there develop in Asahara's theology, if we can call it that, ideas about the apocalypse, the end of the world. He gets involved in the predictions of Nostradamus. He comes to believe that there is a conspiracy against Om that is perpetrated by the news media, by the Japanese government, by the U.S. government, by the Jewish religion, and by the Freemasons. Of course, we would all think of those as all of a kind, I'm sure. So a little paranoia here. Okay, a lot of paranoia here. In light of this context, and knowing what Om did and what it was potentially capable of doing, is Om best described as a terrorist organization, a cult, or something else? In the interest of time, if we address first this issue as is Om Shinrikyo a cult, I have two sort of very brief responses to that. The first response is, as somebody in the academic study of religion, cult is a bad, pejorative word. We don't use it. We don't like to use it. We don't like people who do use it because it really, historically, it's a way of talking about, for example, groups that mainstream Christianity didn't like, the Mormons, Jehovah's Witnesses, Christian Scientists. So it's got that kind of historical weight to it. It also is a term, as you know, from the 1960s and the 1970s, maybe into the 80s, as a way of talking about fringe religions that are probably borrowing from Eastern traditions. There's this notion that there is brainwashing, and there's this charismatic figure who's authoritarian, and everybody has to sort of bow down to this person. The notion that this charismatic leader has this great spiritual power creates this tightly knit organization that demands absolute dedication by the followers. Followers are sometimes are expected to give over their wealth to the religion. There are issues of brainwashing, all of that. If we accept that as a definition of a cult, then it seems to me that Om probably does fit that definition. as tortured and as problematic as that term is. I can tell you that the preferred term these days is NRM, New Religious Movement. Now, I don't think descriptively that's actually all that much better than the word cult, but nevertheless, it does move us at least a little bit away from that pejorative piece. I prefer to ask or spend a little bit more time today talking about, is Aum Shinrikyo a terrorist organization? And if we're going to understand Aum as a terrorist organization, it seems to me we're going to need to fit Aum and his activities into a definition of terrorism. And of course, as soon as we try to find that definition to fit it into, it seems to me that's where our real trouble begins. Because as I think probably most of you know, terrorism is a highly problematic concept. The meaning and application of the word terrorism varies depending upon historical time and place. Similarly, contemporary usage of terrorism is notoriously complex and multivalent. When we talk about terrorism, we are really discussing multiple phenomena, it seems to me, that are just simply loosely lumped together under the rubric of terrorism. To further compound the conceptual issues here, this broad category of terrorism is sometimes narrowed down to more discrete and presumably clear categories. So amongst terrorism's offspring include suicide terrorism, religious terrorism, state terrorism, nationalist terrorism, cyber terrorism, eco-terrorism, narco-terrorism, agro-terrorism, and my favorite, super terrorism. And by the way, Aum probably fits under super terrorism, but get to that in a second. The clarity suggested by such a typology is often fleeting. These different kinds of terrorism are not necessarily mutually exclusive. That's certainly one of the problems. An act of violence involving a suicide bomber might be enacted in the name of religion. Such blurring of categories calls into question the descriptive value of these terms. In the case of Aum Shinrikyo, we might describe their activities as an example of religious terrorism with an ambition toward super terrorism. And super terrorism, as I understand it, is a term usually used to describe the use of some weapon of mass destruction, so that we're not talking about terrorism localized, but terrorism on a much, much larger scale. Given the complexity and ambiguity that attends the term terrorism, of what significant descriptive use is it, and to what ends can it be productively employed? The definition of terrorism that I was playing around with in this presentation is one that's given by Professor Bruce Hoffman. I don't know if he's here yet, but since he will be here today, I thought it might be useful since he can certainly address some of the comments that I'm going to make here. Professor Hoffman argues that in contemporary usage, terrorism refers to, quote, revolutionary or anti-government activity undertaken by non-state or sub-national entities, end quote. He goes on to assert that the goal of such activity is to replace current social and political structures and institutions with new and better ones. Professor Hoffman rejects a formal, rigid definition of terrorism in favor of what he refers to as distinctions between terrorism and other forms of violence. There is a family resemblance to terrorism, even if definition ultimately eludes us. According to Professor Hoffman, there are 5 attributes that distinguish terrorism from the acts of such people or groups as guerrilla movements, ordinary criminals, assassins, and nonviolent political extremists. These 5 are 1, political motivations and goals, 2, violence or the threat of violence, 3, violent actions that impose psychological fear not only on the victims but on a wider community, 4, an organized group or set of cells with a clear hierarchy of authority, and 5, that the group is a non-state or subnational entity. This set of distinguishing characteristics leads Professor Hoffman to an attribute-based definition of terrorism in which he says, quote, terrorism is the deliberate creation and exploitation of fear through violence or the threat of violence in the pursuit of political change, end quote. So from this perspective, does it make conceptual sense to refer to Aum Shinrikyo as a terrorist organization? My own reading of this definition is that it doesn't. To make a long story short again here, although certainly Ohm fits this notion of a group that is violent or has the threat of violence about it, I don't know what else we would call the Tokyo subway sarin gas attack except a horribly violent act. It seems to me that some of these other issues about political motivations and goals are probably not there. There's some argument that Ohm, in fact, engaged in the acts that it did as a way to try to get the media and the government off of their case, not so much that it was a political act of wanting to disrupt or overthrow the Japanese government. We can talk more about that in question and answer. We might also ask whether Aum Shinrikyo is a religious terrorist organization, which brings us into a whole other set of descriptions and definitions, which usually says something along the lines of the thing that gets added to that definition of terrorism, if it's religious terrorism, is it somehow that there is a religious motivation or a religious justification. I think that that's certainly true in this case, that there is religious justification for what Ohm does, but it is not a subnational group, I don't think. It's not organized into cells. It's mostly the work of a few people within the organization to plan and plot out what goes on here. So in that sense, I don't think it fills that very well either. I think the other another way of looking at this is that any terrorist organization is going to justify what it does. And is there something about religious justification to legitimate violent acts that is somehow quantitatively different than an ideological justification, a political justification? I'm doing this for God. I'm doing this because I want to create a certain kind of society. It seems to me there is a similarity that justification always needs to be there. I need to conclude this today, and as I was thinking about how to conclude my remarks, I realized that I had really no very clear way to wrap this up, because it seems that there are too many questions that remain for any kind of satisfying conclusion to be drawn. From my perspective, it's just questions all the way down. For example, does applying the term terrorism or religious terrorism to Aum Shinrikyo's actions help us better understand the motivations of this group? Does application of the term terrorism to Aum cause us to miss other salient aspects of their violent activities? What are the political or ideological implications of calling Aum a religiously motivated terrorist organization as opposed to calling them a religious organization with a violent agenda? Was the subway sarin gas incident an act of terrorism? If so, what does the example of Aum Shinrikyo add to what we understand about terrorism as a global phenomenon? Or does the Aum example suggest that terrorism can only be understood in its local manifestations? In a world that is globally connected and interdependent, is terrorism inevitably a global phenomenon even as it operates locally? Is there any reason to understand the subway sarin gas incident as something other than an act of terrorism? If so, how might we conceptualize this incident? Was it simply a criminal act? It seems to me that our terms, terrorism, religious terrorism, cult, are all highly problematic. And if I were to make an argument today, I would say that Aum Shinrikyo is not fundamentally a terrorist organization. And if I had time to develop that argument, my point of departure would be a comparison of Aum's actions and professed intentions with those of the Japanese Red Army, notorious for such acts of violence as its deadly attack on Tel Aviv's airport in May of 1972. So really my ambition this morning has simply to raise the issue of Aum Shinrikyo and to ask questions all the way down about how the example of Aum might provide us with new ways to think about some of these conceptual issues. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bill. Your talk was really, really, very interesting. It reminded me of I had a great uncle who was in the Gordon Highlanders during the First World War, which meant that he was wearing a kilt in the trenches. And he spoke about being gassed different times, being gassed by chlorine gas, being gassed by phosgene gas, and finally by mustard gas. Incidentally, phosgene is actually a nerve gas fairly similar to sarin in its effects. He wasn't scared of that. He was a little, so you put on your gas mask, which they called helmets, and you were pretty much protected. The problem with mustard gas is it was a blistering agent, and it tended to collect on your body where there were moist, exposed areas. And if you were wearing a kilt, I'll just leave it up to you to guess what kind of problem that caused. I asked him, we didn't have the term weapon of mass destruction at that time, but I asked him, was he afraid of gas? And he said, oh, no, gas was trivial. The weapon of mass destruction was the machine gun. Yeah. So thanks very much. Before I introduce Professor Jerry Piven, I just have a comment from our wonderful conference organizer, who I might remind you was in the Israeli Defense Forces. He says, you must follow the time. So I will get up and go like this, apparently, if you go over. I'm very pleased now to introduce Jerry Piven from the Department of Philosophy here. I love the fact that you teach courses and your research is focused on death, evil, and religion. But I think the book that you're currently working on, which is Death, Religion, and Evil, Eroticisms, Love, Sex, and Perversion, which I guarantee is going to sell very well when it comes out. It's very interesting that you have training in psychoanalysis as well as in psychology and in religion. So we look very forward to what you have to say.
Thank you. And by the way, Bill, having trained at a psychoanalytic institute, I can say that the term cult is not inappropriate. Okay, so, all right.
DSM-4 category?
Yeah, yes, thank you. I'll be here all week. Okay. Sheikh Yusuf al-Qaradawi writes, suicide actions are the most exalted aspect of the jihad for the sake of Allah. Shadi Sulaiman al-Nabahim says, hold tightly to the religion of God. Guide your children to the mosque and instruct them to attend the Quran and recitation lessons and teach them to love jihad and martyrdom. This presentation would argue that suicide bombing is more than a conscious strategy designed to murder and terrorize enemies and oppressors. A psychological understanding of suicide bombing consequently requires more than a delineation of the stated motives and putative goals of the attack. Now, of course, not all suicide bombers have the same philosophy or political agenda. The intent is not to reduce them to caricatures and so forth. They hail from different countries, societies, cultures, and organizations. They have different experiences, emotions, and ways of imagining life and death. A psychological approach to suicide bombing is initiated by the axiom that there are profound and powerful motives of which people are completely unaware and indeed don't wish to know. So this article and presentation therefore attempts to understand not only why suicide bombers say they're destroying themselves and others, but seeks to discern what is not being said, what is being disavowed, obscured, and fulfilled in suicide bombing beyond the awareness of the actor. Now, this being said, much of the prominent work on terrorism focuses on strategic, political, and socioeconomic factors. As Hafez writes, suicide terrorism is a strategic choice based on cost-benefit calculations by weak groups with limited resources seeking to wage war against formidable opponents. Under conditions of asymmetrical power, disadvantaged groups seek to protect their meager financial, material, and human resources and place a premium on secrecy and organizational maintenance. Therefore, militant groups utilize forms of indirect warfare. Among the plethora of recent studies, Pape's monumental work also incorporates comprehensive profiles to analyze suicide bombing as a political strategy rather than the consequence of Islamic fundamentalism. Pape claims that over 95% of suicide attacks are campaigns orchestrated by sizable militant organizations with substantial public support. Suicide terrorism is positively correlated with military occupation by the United States, which colludes with corrupt and undemocratic regimes and dictators. Suicidal terrorism therefore derives predominantly from countries considered American allies, where large segments of the populace resent American imperialism, occupation, and interference. In this way of thinking, there is the presumption that it is a calculated, rational choice And this is why numerous scholars, not only Pape, but people like Gerald Post and Scott Atran, and many others who are eminently respectable, still presume that the group must be relatively rational since they weed out the lunatics. Whereas research into group psychology demonstrates how significant conglomerations of individuals can engage in group fantasies, all sharing ideas, wishes, and convictions with absolute certainty that are nevertheless entirely fictive. Not only is the group not a barometer of reality, as though consensus made truth, or as though a larger population, the more likely it would be that their perceptions would be correct, but that groups function in ways that validate and mutually reinforce fantasies. Fictions can be validated, propagandized, reinforced, canonized, mythologized, and naturalized as absolute fact in a group. So not only does a group not seek reality or have a better chance of grasping it with the network of multiple minds, but the group tends toward regression and magical thinking, losing the capacity for reality and independent thought. While sometimes retaining realistic anchors, other crucial aspects of cognition erode in the group, while the unreal is made to appear sensible and factual by mutual agreement and the pleasure in group confirmation. So, therefore, members of such groups may or may not be individually pathological. The group itself still suffers from various modes of irreality, even paranoia, possibly delusions concerning their enemies, the world, and the theological beliefs that are utterly real to them. So, therefore, while compelling arguments have been made for the strategic use of suicide missions, this doesn't necessarily or even remotely preclude other multiple overdetermined emotions and motives. And this is why Hafez, whom I quoted earlier, would even conclude, strategy alone just cannot explain the decision of individuals to accept the role of martyrs. To probe the motivations of individual bombers, we need to look beyond strategic calculations and into the realm of cultural frameworks and religious appeals. Palestinian martyrs are celebrated, honored, and publicized on murals and posters. Wills and final letters reveal the joy in martyrdom and exaltation of God. So let me quote a few of these for you. My last wish to you, my family, is that none of you should weep in my procession to heaven. Indeed, distribute dates and ululate in the wedding of martyrdom. Another note left behind says, love for jihad and martyrdom has come to possess my life, my being, my feelings, my heart, and my senses. Yet another writes, dear Father, if I do not defend my religion, my land, and the holy sites, then who will liberate the land and the holy places? We only die once, let it be for the sake of God. One other says, may our blood become the light that shows the way toward liberation for those around us. Let us raise the banner of truth, the banner of Islam. Finally, one further writer leaves behind a note that says, I ask God Almighty that martyrdom is my message. It's the theological and apocalyptic language that calls for some kind of further explanation beyond the strategic interpretation. To ignore the profusion of such theologically fanatical discourse is to eradicate the actual words of many terrorists, or so-called terrorists. The strategic aspects of suicide bombing are the conscious purpose. In psychoanalytic terms, the conscious purpose is manifest content. It is a facade, a surface, a colineous veil that obscures the elusive life beneath. This does not mean that conscious motives must be false or dishonest, but it is sometimes the case. Conscious rationales often frame and distort the most irrational, chaotic, ulterior motives so they may appear rational, logical, justifiable, moral, and heroic, disguising their purposes to avoid the humiliating appearance of sordidness in irrationality. Conscious explanation is only a mythologization of oneself and transforms the unknown or ignoble into noble and heroic choice before oneself and society. Therefore, a psychoanalytic understanding recognizes the immensely tangled complexity of motivation, that ideas and events are not merely conscious and rational, but are a conglomeration of fantasies, inner conflicts, ghosts of the past compelling present action, and projecting past perceptions, archaic relations that determine the way we experience and distort the world. The present can be the unconscious recreation of past relationships, the compulsion to repeat and resolve lost scenarios, by inflicting them on others, and on unknown surrogates and victims. As Movahedi writes, constructive or destructive engagements with the world are symbolic expressions of inner struggles that seek resolution in relation to the internal objects. So in addition to the strategic value of suicide bombing, then, the psychoanalytic question might be, what emotional value there might be in dying? What the death performs not only ideologically, but unconsciously. One naturally asks why, among the vast range of possibilities, suicide is deemed most heroic. As Beit Halami writes, patriotic self-sacrifice makes sense and is idealized, but most patriots don't want to die in war, and most believers don't want to be martyrs. Thus, death as a consequence and death as a purpose must be distinguished. If suicide is not the only choice, the final option after all others have been exhausted, or even the most effective way of killing or terrorizing people, one should ask why the idea of self-murder is so enticing. I suggest here that contra Pape's view that suicide bombing is geometrically more effective than other terroristic strategies, there are other things that must be factored into the equation of what the most efficient means of death might be. For instance, one must question whether suicide bombing is so effective when in fact the military reprisals are so devastating and kill so many innocent victims, including women and children. Palestinian suicide bombers are in no danger of eliminating the Jewish population, but they do invite the retaliatory persecution, annihilation, and immiseration of their own people. How efficient is that? And by the way, this does not claim that anybody deserves any of this. It's not actually any kind of a political attribution of blame. It's trying to understand the psychological motives beyond, again, the strategy. The entire process is cyclical and rife with fantasy, for oppression may breed terroristic responses which breed retaliation vastly more atrocious, which then becomes further justification for terrorism. Psychologically, this is an invitation to victimization that provides the oppressed with proof of moral superiority in the wickedness of the enemy. It is what Moses Hrushevsky calls deployment, the orchestration of one's own victimization to prove the other evil and purify the sense of guilt, shame, culpability, or self-loathing. It transforms victimization not into something that one participates in, but something that is purely the other's fault. And this is an extremely, I think, common strategy. Again, it does not mean anybody deserves it. The very strategy of suicide bombers thus contains deeper psychological satisfactions and processes than merely killing or terrifying. The projection of evil, and this is not just for them or our enemies, it's for us too, and I think while I'm talking about this one, might consider how much this is going on, especially with our country as we invade Iraq and coordinate and capture thousands of people and so forth. The projection of evil exceeds mapping illusory qualities onto others or even attributing one's own illicit motives to them. The projection, the creation of evil itself as a fantasy, evacuates rage and the loathsome aspects of the self on the other in order to murder oneself and purify the self of badness in the other. It also seeks to evacuate abjection into the other, to render one as humiliated and abject as oneself. It forces a corresponding introjection on the recipients of violence, and its purpose is filling living victims with one's own horror, defeating and conquering by reducing them to paroxysms of terror. As Walter Davis states, terror's origin is a feeling of inner powerlessness. Its purpose is to reverse that condition by reducing others to it. At the center of this psyche, one invariably finds an overwhelming presence, that of a malevolent, destructive other who has command over the psyche more complete than that of the most extreme superego. The terrorist's inner world is one of ceaseless persecution and unbridled cruelty. Wounds must be turned into weapons. Now, it should be noted here that this powerlessness issues not only from political and cultural oppression, but a socialization process of shame and humiliation descending from people in one's own culture. This doesn't omit the unimaginable abjection of living in squalor when an occupying government continually employs its military to inflict humiliation, depredation, and terror. It does, however, emphasize other aspects of the psychological process that don't originally derive solely from political oppression. There are times when Paranoia and delusion have become a part of the psychological architecture. They are the consequence of manifold historic and social trauma, a life of persecution, misery, and abjection, an existence of curtsy and horror witnessing relentless indignation, suffering, and death. But it is also a recuperation of autonomy from helplessness and victimization. What I'm saying then is that the fantasy and the violence and the self-obliteration can transform humiliation and defeat into triumph and victory. As the analyst Edith Jacobson wrote of suicide, it can be a reclamation from fate, a way of repossessing one's body, one's identity and life when one feels dispossessed, controlled, or enslaved. As I've mentioned, the murdered enemy can become a substitute for the hated self. Vladimir Volkan has described the internalization of trauma that leads to generational unconscious communication of victimization and humiliation. Here we have children not only observing victimization, but hearing stories, perceiving the pain and humiliation of parents, identifying with that pain and indignation, and even interjecting that wounded parental presence. Once again, the urge to retaliate represents not only vengeance against others, but a hidden executioner murdering others as surrogates for this hate itself. In a further way, then, suicidal violence can represent a response to self-loathing, humiliation, and abjection, a reclamation of physical and spiritual autonomy, and a transcendence of oppression in oneself. Not least, the obliteration of self and other transcends death. Mortality is a physical reality, but it's also a fantasy and complex symbol that varies between individuals and cultures. The symbol of death joins multiple meanings that may include the shame and disgust for a vulnerable body that weakens, defecates, and decays, a body of flesh that desires disgusting things like sex with beings considered inferior and contemptible, such as women as perceived, not as ontological reality, whose bodies are reviled by some as contaminated and castrating in numerous societies. Death is the defeated, castrated, victimized self. Transcending death means transforming the most horrific, terrifying, disgusting, ignoble dread into invulnerability, beyond the body, sex, decay, and fear. A loyal servant who sacrifices himself for people and God, vanquishing evil, the suicide bomber feels joy bathed in the vision of meeting Allah in paradise. This is why theology is such a crucial aspect of martyrdom and suicide bombing. One need not have theological motives to destroy oneself or the enemy, but the theological fantasy transforms death into rebirth, not just an earthly, but cosmic heroism, the love of God, glory in paradise with eternal bliss and scores of dark-eyed virgins. A secular death cannot raise the mangled body from gelatinated flesh into eternal life. It cannot be a miraculous apotheosis where the Shaheed and his God look down triumphantly on the vanquished enemy. A secular suicide may still contain the unconscious fantasy of rebirth, but this is different from a conscious vision of sacred death and rebirth adorned and adored by one's people. Transcending the flesh with godlike power in iridescent death, an incendiary convulsion that bathes the slaughtered enemies in one's own blood and bowels, leaving them behind in a tangled mass of ignoble corpses as one reaps God's reward beyond death, is the stated purpose of such murders. This is not necessarily only the way theology can be manipulated, although it is. One could also suggest that this is one purpose, not the only purpose, of the sacred. Its very invention. One shouldn't imagine that a life of piety moves people to destroy themselves in this way, as though honest Muslims studying the Quran and Hadith were blithely pursuing the only path Sharia cleared for them. This is not claiming that theology must make people violent, or certainly that it's not claiming at all that Islam must be inherently violent. Even if they were following, honestly, Muslim law, this wouldn't explain the fervid ecstasy in the face of death. There are many forms of sacredness, but the genesis of one crucial formation or manifestation of the sacred is the act of consecrating the violent, the horrible, that which arouses overwhelming cadences of terror, ecstasy, and unfathomable destructiveness. The sacred isn't just inherited, it's fabricated. endowed, imparted. One makes an act sacred to give it cosmic importance, fabricates rituals, vestments, and obligations, and pronounces them numinous, endows it all with an aura of unworldly magic, imparts divinity, and renders all that falls under its auspices holy. Blessedness is imagined and conferred. Violence becomes sacred not only when people wish to rationalize it. People may indeed use theological rhetoric to sanctify the mundane, impart the appearance of holiness to vile acts, and provide a facade of righteousness to lascivious and profane motives. But the sacred has been devised in the first place to provide that sense of ineluctable, irrevocable, transcendent sanctimony, blessedness, and force. Murder has been sanctified since human beings created rituals. Human sacrifice, the scapegoat, the pharmakon, the buphonia, the Aztec flaying of prisoners and princesses, all manner of ritual have been wrought to lavish divinity on death and on the act of slaughter. Blood magically makes life germinate, propitiates bloodthirsty creatures, eliminates evil, purifies and sanctifies the living community, inflicting death in the name of God, whom they have invented and whom they have conceived and delivered unto the universe, so they may transcend death and satisfy a profound yearning for love and hallow vengeance and pious obedience to their own fantasy. One might not only ask how people can murder in the name of God, but how eros can ever be born when human beings are beset by death, misery, horror, and abjection. But even here, in many cases, the so-called terrorist murders for love, bathes in his love of God and the joy of basking in God's love. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jerry. That was really very interesting. My background is not in the sacred in terrorism, but in terrorism financing. And hearing you speak reminded me of Lord Keynes's famous comment that in the long run, we're all dead. And that may have something really directly bearing on the issue. I also think of, didn't Churchill say when, if you're about to be killed during the anticipated German invasion, that you can always take one with you. And I guess if you add the sacred to that. Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum assalam.
Our next speaker is Parvez Ahmed, whom I know of actually not through the topic you're going to speak on today, but through your work on mutual funds, so it's very nice to have you. He is chairman of the Council on American-Islamic Relations and a professor at the University of North Florida, and we're having some nice weather for you today. I hope you appreciate it. And has written an enormous amount in this area, particularly in popular press. And you're going to speak today on terror in the nation of Islam, unholy war, not jihad. Thank you.
Thank you. I need to break the monotony of sitting there. Okay. Thank you. Well, thank you for this invitation, Amos, for having the opportunity to speak and address on a very important topic. And thank you to my co-panelists for making some very, very interesting remarks. Hopefully during question and answers we can go into detail because I have some questions about some of the issues that they have raised. The topic that I would be speaking on is terror in the name of Islam, because often terror in the name of Islam has been described as Islamic terrorism, jihad, jihadism, jihadist, Islamic totalitarianism, and Islamofascism, and on and on and on. So the question is, why does Islam and terrorism or Islam and violence get intertwined with each other? Part of the problem is the religious or the rhetoric that is used by terrorists such as, and I make a quote over here from Osama bin Laden, 1996, and I've underlined some of the words where he intertwines religious imagery with political rhetoric. He's speaking of a political grievance, but he's intertwining it with several religious, powerful, actually very powerful religious imagery, invoking religious words such as Iman, which is the foundation of faith in Islam, invoking the two holy places, the name of the Prophet, and so on and so forth. So naturally it is quite easy to see how such language can shape the popular perception that there has to be a religious motivation or Islamic motivation behind terrorism. Further, when we come to 9/11, the fact that 9/11 was an attack committed by Muslims, that also perpetuates the notion that there is some causal link between Islam and terrorism. Also undeniable is that this perception is greatly assisted by what I call a cottage industry. There is an industry, I've coined a phrase for it called bash and cash industry. It's a bash and cash industry that perpetuates this notion that there is something intrinsic about Islam that is causing terrorism. And you can see that in the proliferation of so-called experts on television. They're constantly insinuating this. You can go to Amazon.com, type the word Islam, and see what type of books come up. Probably the majority of the top-selling books on Islam are written in a way that is not just favorable to Islam. I'm not looking for even favorable, just neutral, just to give the scholarly exposition of what the faith is, and you don't see that. Also, this faulty terminology, and I'll go into some of them, Islamic terrorism, Islamic fascism, and so on, they all kind of conflate this understanding that there is something intrinsic there's an intrinsic link between Islam and terrorism, or a causal link between Islam and terrorism. So the paper or the presentation that I'll do, and I certainly will not have time to go into all the details over here, but I'll just briefly allude to some of the definitions of terrorism, look at the recent history of terrorism being committed in the name of Islam, posit some causal links. What could be some links between terrorism and broader policies, whether it's in the Middle East or even going back to the U.S. Cold War programs. And finally, hopefully propose some remedies or ways in which it can be contained, if not eliminated. On September 12th, President Bush declared the global war on terror. And the global war on terror is primarily a Pentagon operation. 90% of the funding for the global war on terror goes to Pentagon or military-related operations. But the question is, can a war really be waged against terrorism? After all, terrorism is not an ideology, it's a tactic. So how does one wage a war against a tactic? Also, the question of terrorism is that one of the things that we see is that these alert levels, last night Jerry and we were talking about during dinner, these alert levels. You sit in at an airport and you suddenly hear alert level at what, orange?
Orange, yeah.
Orange, which means what? Perpetual readiness or imminent? Terror attack is imminent. So does it create a sense of fear? Of course it does. Does it create a sense of hype? Perhaps. Is the threat exaggerated, overblown? Perhaps all of them. But nonetheless, you cannot really fault anybody from being to err on the side of caution. But the problem that I see is that there is really a lack of serious debate, and underscored serious debate, about the question of terrorism. And what has happened any time when somebody wants to discuss it, talk about it, or talk about the root causes of terrorism, it is almost used as an attack against those persons to say you are soft on terrorism, you are apologizing for terrorism, and thus we see there is no serious debate. There is lack of understanding in the public about what terrorism is, what is causing it, and how to go about addressing it. Terrorism is indeed a pejorative term, as Hoffman speaks about, and thus detractors would use that label. Certainly Muslim groups are perhaps most vulnerable to that label. Anytime you stand up and speak about the issue, trying to analyze it, you automatically get thrown the label, oh, you are soft on terrorism because your people are committing it. And that certainly does not help discourse. So that's why I have a particular appreciation for having this invitation to address this topic over here. When you look at global patterns of terrorism, and this is from a database put together by MIPT, and I forgot what the acronym stands for. It's a terrorism knowledge base, tkb.org. It's a semi-government funded institution, and they have looked at terrorism incidents from 1968 to 2007, and they've classified by the affiliation of the group. And you see religion is a contributor, but not certainly a major contributor. The top two contributors are communist socialist groups or nationalist separatist groups. Now, when we talk about terrorism, the popular idea is to talk about terrorism in the context of subnational or clandestine groups. but the genesis of terrorism comes from government action. Its genesis in 1795 and during the French Revolution. And not only did that word terrorism was popularized during that time, but also the reaction to terrorism was also terroristic. So when you have terrorism and you have a reaction to that that is also terrorism, how do you analyze that? Or does it probably fall under this category of super terrorism now? Then when you move forward in time, in the 19th century, terrorism was mostly committed by radical political groups or revolutionaries, primarily anarchists. Then in the 20th century, communism was the primary factor behind terrorism. And then you move forward to the more current times. You have religious motivation, but you also have national liberation groups. And you have this famous statement that one person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter. And you see that, political groups, national liberation groups, at one point or another in time, by their own by the governments that they were fighting against, were labeled as terrorists, only later to be called heroes, not only within their own population, but globally. Begin, Arafat, Mandela, they all went on to win Nobel Peace Prize. Nonetheless, one may have a perfectly beautiful cause to be fighting against, but if one commits a terrorist act, it should be regarded as terrorism. But the problem again is, as the previous two panelists talked about, is what is the definition of terrorism? We don't have a clear definition of terrorism. There are definitions that you can pull from the dictionary. You can see definitions from the U.S. government. And again, within the U.S. government, you see differences within those definitions. Between the FBI definition of terrorism, the State Department definition of terrorism, and the Defense Department definition of terrorism, there are differences. But what you can cull out of them is what Bill was talking about from Hoffman's elemental definitions. What are the elements that constitute terrorism? And I will not repeat them because Bill has already pointed them out. Violence, psychological impact, perpetrated for a political goal, deliberate targeting of non-combatants. Where I have a point of departure is that Hoffman excludes states from being part of this elemental definition. His argument is that states are moderated by their population that they serve, so thus states cannot commit terrorism or should not be looked as perpetrators of terrorism. I have a point of departure over here. I think while most definitions would allude to non-state actors or subnational groups, but if terrorism is committed by governments, or if governments undertake action that meet those other four criteria, that's violence, they have a psychological impact, they're perpetrated for a political goal, and there is targeting of non-combatants, then they should also be described as committing terrorism or engaging in terrorism. Now, to the central part of my presentation, what is the link between, or what is the Islamic perspective on violence and terrorism? First, let me give you a foundational element of Islam. The word, many of you may know Islam, the word Islam means peace. It comes from the root word salam, which means peace. Now, when you look at and I'm going to pull mostly from the Quran and the practices of Prophet Muhammad, so as to give the elemental basis of where Islam stands on this question of violence and terrorism, and then look at how other groups have used it or abused it. The Quran fundamentally teaches pluralism, as one of the verses of the Quran says, "O humankind, we have created you from a male and female, and we made you into races and tribes so that you may know each other. The most noble in the sight of God are those who are God conscious. God is omniscient, fully aware." So this idea that Islam is going to require everybody to believe the same way and act the same way is contradictory to the teachings of the Quran. Islam promotes pluralism, recognizes that the fact that we are different as people or as faith or as beliefs or as ethnicity or food or whatever else is part of God's conscious design. And the point of being different is not that we despise each other, but we come to know each other. So the point of difference is to use as a motivation to come closer to each other and the most noble in the sight of God are people who are God conscious. When you look at Islamic law or jurisprudence, you would see that there are three elements around which Islamic jurisprudence centers. It is the preservation of life, honor, and dignity. Any Islamic law can be deconstructed to its root of that they are constructed in a way to preserve those three elements. So sanctity of life is codified in the Quran, as one of the verses I quote over here, and do not kill a person which God has made sacred except by the way of justice and law. And if anyone killed a person, it is as if they have killed entire humanity. So it is not surprising that Muslim jurists have issued edicts against terrorism, and I'll quote one of them over here, which was issued by, there are many such, actually in my paper I provide a footnote of several such opinions, but I'll quote the one that was issued by American Muslims. And the American Muslim community has always taken a principled position on this issue of terrorism. Each gruesome act that shocked Americans, whether the murder of Daniel Pearl in Pakistan or the bombing of a Jewish Cedar party in Israel, to the beheading of Nicholas Berg in Iraq, to the massacre in Beslan, subway bombings in London, has equally shocked American Muslims and brought swift and unequivocal condemnation. So the American Muslim organizations issued a fatwa that was signed by more than 120 U.S. Muslim groups and leaders. And here is just a brief rendition, just a brief quotation, this long statement. Number one, it says that Islam strictly condemns religious extremism and the use of violence against innocent lives. There is no justification in Islam for extremism or terrorism. Targeting civilians or life or property through suicide bombings or any other method of attack is haram, and the word haram simply in Arabic means forbidden. And those who commit these barbaric acts are criminals, not martyrs. And the fatwa goes on to strongly state that all acts of terrorism targeting civilians are forbidden in Islam. It is forbidden or haram for a Muslim to cooperate with any individual or group that is involved in any act of terrorism or violence. And it also says that it is a civic and religious duty of Muslims to cooperate with law enforcement authorities to protect the life of all civilians. And that's how the fatwa then ends. Islam also forbids suicide. In the Islamic ethos, the beginning, which is birth, and the end, which is death, is the will of God. And suicide thus implies a lack of trust in God or lack of faith in His benevolence, mercy, love, wisdom, and knowledge. So Prophet Muhammad is reported to have said when it was mentioned to him that a man committed suicide because he had very severe wounds, he said that God said to him that my servant has caused death upon himself hurriedly, so I forbid paradise for him. And this question about which was often raised, the question about 72 virgins, actually does not exist anywhere in the Quran. Or anywhere in that the reward for martyrs, the 72 virgins, does not exist anywhere in the Quran or in the sayings of Prophet Muhammad. So what is jihad? Linguistically, jihad is an Arabic term. Arabic, like Hebrew, has root words, and if you can understand the root words, you would be able to understand the meaning of those words. The word literally means to strive or to exert effort. It has the same root as the legal term ijtihad, and ijtihad refers to the exertion of intellectual effort in order to develop an informed opinion on a new issue or problem. However, to the Western ear, jihad translates as holy war. The Arabic equivalent of holy war would be harb muqaddas, and that phrase does not appear anywhere in any of the Islamic texts. So jihad can be, again, it's a very interesting and a very detailed topic. I will just quote one of the sayings of Prophet Muhammad when he was returning from a military campaign. He said, "We have returned from the lesser jihad to the greater jihad." So jihad can be then classified into three types of categories. Number one, it's a verbal jihad, which means to strive for justice through words and nonviolent action. When Prophet Muhammad was asked what kind of jihad is best, he said, a word of truth in front of an oppressive or tyrant ruler. The second form of jihad is a personal jihad, which is the intimate struggle to purify one's soul from evil influences. And finally, there is a concept of physical jihad, which is to use physical force, but not as a war of aggression, but as a self-defense or self-preservation. Islam also outlines what are called the golden rules of war. Many of those rules would not sound very archaic to us because they're part of the Geneva Convention, which I'm not sure. Are we still signatory to the Geneva Convention? But if you look at it, the golden rules of war talk about do not commit treachery, do not mutilate dead bodies, do not kill a child or a woman or an aged person, bring no harm to trees, and so on and so forth. If you pass by places of worship, leave them alone, do not desecrate them, do not attack them, do not poison wells and harm trees that can affect the food supply of people. So these are some of the rules of war that are codified within Islamic jurisprudence. But also when the Quran talks about war, it talks about war always as self-defense and in proportional force. It does not talk about, the Quran does not instruct war as aggression. And even when permitting war, the Quran emphasizes the wisdom of making peace. When circumstances permit, as the Quran says, if the enemy inclines towards peace, then make peace. Peace is the first choice. War is always a last choice in an Islamic framework. Now, when we talk about linkages between Islam, so given all of this textual or normative aspects of Islam, how do we constantly see this linkage between Islam and terrorism? Part of the fact, as I mentioned before, that Al-Qaeda or other groups identify themselves as quote-unquote Islamic groups. However, as Pape talks about, we have to look beyond the superficial claims of these groups to understand really what is their motive. Part of the problem is that their rhetoric about Islamic motivations to their action does not stand up to scrutiny. For example, when bin Laden talks about declaring jihad, there are several problems with that concept. Number one, in the Islamic jurisprudence framework, individuals and organizations cannot declare a war. Any kind of war cannot be declared by individuals or organizations. Only states can declare that. And even in war, as I mentioned, one cannot kill innocent women and children. One cannot wage war against a country in which Muslims can freely practice their religion, i.e. the U.S. And when there is a consensus of condemnation in the Islamic jurisprudence, it forms what is called ijma, and ijma forms almost, it is only second to the sacred texts in terms of religious authority. And actions of Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda have been universally condemned by Islamic jurists. Reputable Islamic jurists, respected Islamic jurists. So again, Pape suggests that Al-Qaeda's principal motive is not religious. It is to end a foreign occupation in Muslim countries. And he poses a question. Would religious or ideological provocations suffice if United States and the European allies did not station troops in the Middle East? And he presents statistical evidence to suggest that the taproot for Al-Qaeda's animosity to enemies is what they do, not who they are. When we come to the question of Hamas and Hezbollah, the organizations that are labeled as terrorist organization in the U.S. State Department list, we also have to understand that they are also part of democratic governments. They are, in that sense, very similar to either the Sinn Féin IRA analogy or the LTTE analogy of Sri Lanka, where they have committed terrorist acts, but they are also active in social work, and they also have an active political wing. The UN Charter and resolutions affirm that all people have the inalienable right to seek liberation from foreign domination and alien subjugation. However, the right to resistance does not sanction the targeting of civilians. When we talk about these groups, unlike Al-Qaeda, they do not embrace violence as a matter of policy. These groups have, by and large, not targeted people who are outside the land they view as occupied territory. This suggests that their fury, while understandable but not justified, is directed towards people they view as occupying their homeland. And when we look at Palestinian suicide bombings, we see that they are not just committed by religiously motivated groups like Hamas, they're also carried out by secular groups or Marxist groups like PFLP and the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade. So the genesis of violence, as Pape contends, and I would submit over here, is war and occupation. Hezbollah was created as a result of Israeli invasion of Lebanon in June 1992, and the resistance to Israeli occupation began in 1972. This is in the occupied territories, but it was not until 1987 that the resistance began to become progressively violent, and it was not until September 2000 that it turned into suicide bombings. So Islam is not the driving force behind Palestinian suicide bombings. It is the progressive intensification of the Palestinian rebellion along with increased Israeli force against that rebellion that is a major contributing factor. Ed Mersheimer and Walt writes that Palestinian terrorism is not random violence directed against Israel or the West. It is largely a response to Israel's prolonged campaign to colonize the West Bank and Gaza Strip. So I'll skip this. Let me just get to my conclusion. I have only 2 more minutes left. We look at the terrorism by year, 2001, which is the black bar in the middle of the graph, 9/11 attacks, and since then we declared the global war on terror on 2001, and since then terrorism has pretty much increased every year. So terrorism is on the rise despite our declaration of a global war on terror. Many Muslims question, is the global war on terror really a war against terrorism, or is this a war against Islam? The perception in the Muslim world is that this is a war against Islam. There is a Gallup poll that was conducted which showed that 90 to 95% of people in the Muslim world do not believe the United States to be trustworthy. Nearly 80% believe that the U.S. does not care about human rights. And there's a long list of incidents or long list of things that have happened that have kind of solidified or created this perception. From the Iraq War to the faulty pretext to the war, high Iraqi casualty, some estimates putting it over 500,000, Abu Ghraib, in the domestic front, the erosion of civil liberties, and the erosion of the progress of democracy in many of America's Muslim allies. Democracy is not advancing, it is receding in Pakistan, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Jordan. So there is a very interesting book that was written by Professor Mahmoud Mamdani of Columbia University, and I kind of borrowed this title from his book. The title of the book is Good Muslim, Bad Muslim. And he makes this assertion that during the Cold War, America divided the Muslim world between those who were with us, and those were the good Muslims, and those who were against us, and they were the bad Muslims. The good Muslims, no matter how undemocratic or oppressive, were paraded as westernized and secularized, while the bad Muslims, even if elected by democratic means, were demonized as fanatical and insidious. So when we look at the Cold War evidence, we see during the Cold War, 1 million Afghanis were dead, 5 million were refugees, 1.5 million were wounded. Afghanistan is a country of 15 million people. That's almost 50% of the population. And when we pulled out of Afghanistan, we did not put together a Marshall Plan to revive or stabilize the society. So what happened? We left the country with a lot of guns, a lot of gunpowder, a major nexus of world drug trade, and with no support. It is not surprising what happened thereafter in Afghanistan, how the Taliban formed and how Al-Qaeda made Afghanistan their base. So in my conclusion, I will just leave you with this, just one slide. What is the way forward? The way forward is to recognize that there is a paradigm shift in the Muslim world. The future of engagement with the Muslim world will depend upon our understanding of the local citizenry, not the goodwill of the ruling elites. Our engagement so far has been with the ruling elites, not with the common people. There is a rising religiosity in the Muslim world, and that religiosity has to be harnessed, engaged, not be afraid of, not be used as an excuse for occupation. American foreign policy needs to reflect American values of freedom, democracy, dignity, and dialogue. And American Muslims can greatly aid in improving this dialogue or facilitating this dialogue, because the American Muslim population, unlike other Western minorities, are highly educated, very well integrated, and very patriotic. So American policymakers need to constructively engage this American Muslim population in projecting American policy into the Muslim world. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Parvez, for a very interesting talk. You reminded me that when I've been in South Asia, I haven't witnessed, but I've certainly been present where individuals from every major and some minor religious group, and I think every single religious group is represented in South Asia, has committed some kind of atrocity on another group, typically of civilians, claiming that they were representing a particular religious faith, and that is every single religious faith, all of which, at least in their sacred texts, claim to be peaceful and to oppose these kinds of atrocities. And yet there's some change, some shift from the sacred texts or from respected religious commentators to what is some sort of perceived view of the religion that permits this kind of thing. But thank you very much. Now we're going to have a question and answer period. Please, we have two individuals with microphones, so please wait until you get the microphone before you ask your question, and let's open it up to discussion.
Thank you. If we're going to spend all day talking about terrorism, is it possible to settle on one basic definition of terrorism, perhaps non-combat situation in which violent attacks occur on innocent non-combatants for political goals? That suffice. When Bush went to the UN to try to get the UN involved in the war on terror, he ran into the immediate storm of, are you going to include all people rebelling against colonial powers? And I don't think they ever settled on a definition and thus didn't get the UN as involved as they hoped they would.
So is there a single definition of terrorism?
No. And I say that, I mean, not to dismiss the attempt, but simply to say that whatever definition that we might agree to, even for the purposes of this symposium today, will allow us to focus on certain aspects, and that any definition will then also obscure other aspects. So I guess I prefer to see it in terms of something more along the lines of family resemblance, that we know it when we see it, or we think we know it when we see it, and maybe try to construct definitions out of specific examples as opposed to from kind of a top-down, where we have this abstract definition that somehow then all the material falls under.
Yeah. And the RAND Corporation, by the way, apparently has over 120 different definitions. The only one I think they lack is the raising of the terror level to terrorize their own people into supporting an illegal war. So we could be inclusive, maybe. That's fine.
Okay, thanks.
Yes, this is for Professor Deal. Did the Ohm Group ever commit any acts of terror prior to the Serum attack? And what prompted this? Could you expand on that again?
Sure. Yes, there were incidents that we would probably refer to as, in retrospect anyway, as similar kinds of terrorist attacks. They were on a much lesser scale. Depending on who you read, this is a movement that went from being somewhat positive, that if people engage in these various kinds of ascetic and religious practices, they can gain an understanding, a personal enlightenment, that kind of thing. But gradually moving away from that to the sort of apocalyptic vision. Asahara Shoko was sure that the world would end as a result of World War. There were various years given, 2001, 2, I forget what they are. So it becomes an increasingly dark kind of vision of the world, and very much becomes this struggle between good and evil. Needless to say, Om, from his perspective, represents the good, the spiritual, and the evil is the material world. It's governments, but a lot of this has to do with sort of paranoia about Om is now a persecuted group, and you've got these national entities, the media, and various other organizations doing the persecuting. Actually, Jerry might want to add to this, because Jerry's also studied Om.
Well, they certainly tried to murder a number of people, even though sometimes they bungled it and accidentally killed the people they weren't trying to murder. But they also often referred to murder as poa. So part of the murdering process was considered enlightenment. Now, that might be a rationalization for some really heinous act, but they were also drawing on some pretty esoteric religious practices and doctrines. For instance, the 16th century Japanese Buddhist sect called Tajikawa-ryu, which thought that the way to enlighten somebody was to kill them by sodomizing them with a spear. So you never know. So this murder enlightenment transformed, as Beal just said, Dr. Beal just said, into a kind of apocalyptic theology, and it's hard to know exactly what they were trying to do.
The other thing, just simply from a religious studies perspective, there is very little consistency or logic in these different views. I mean, they're not commensurate at all, and so it's very confusing to try to tease out some sort of logic to even the kind of presentation of doctrine that Asahara is working from.
This is a question for Professor Piven, Jerry Piven, and I'm going to try to get this out. Suicide is an aberration in our society and in our culture, and it's hard to understand suicide as a tactic, even as a tactic. Okay, that's a premise. But in describing some of the motivations for suicide, so we can sort of get our arms around it, understand it, perhaps even appreciate it, I just heard I heard a lot of Freudianism in your explanation of the motivation behind some of those actions. Isn't it not too appropriate to take an approach, a psychological approach from one culture, and then impose it on another one when another culture perhaps isn't even Freudianistic? So this idea of self-loathing of the body and castration and that's something that even the women's movement fought 30 years ago and thought the women had overcome, in understanding ourselves. And so now I'm hearing it again. So could you please address what I'm saying?
Yeah, sure. First of all, it's not particularly Freudian. Psychoanalytic can't be reduced to Freudianism. All this work comes from work with suicidal patients after Freud. It comes from a lot of clinical studies and doesn't necessarily rely on any particular approach. It's what have we learned from people who have tried to commit suicide or having suicidal feelings. And the question is then asked, can this field of inquiry shed any light on phenomena which otherwise might be rather opaque? It's a question. It's not a mapping on of theory onto other people, especially people we find different. It's a question of can we not reduce, but can we expand the potential for understanding something from having learned something from people who have feelings, and it's always a question, right? It doesn't prove anything. It's always a question which is aimed to expand the understanding, not reduce it, and not to demonize anybody else. And certainly when we're dealing with other cultures, there's always that question, which we didn't really have time to get into, but there's this really unavoidable question: to what degree, in any case, when we're trying to understand other human beings, whether from within our culture or from within another culture, to what degree are we projecting our own fantasies upon them? All right. So this is an ineluctable problem, which cannot be resolved so easily, but it perhaps can have the potential to deepen the mode of inquiry. I don't know how complicated an answer you want. Right. I wanted to say one thing which I just forgot to say. I met a Saudi Arabian analyst a few years ago, and we were talking about these very same issues, because there's going to be this problem, especially with otherness, and therefore these fantasies we have about each other. And she kept saying intrapsychic is intrapsychic. Now, I don't know if I agree with that or not, but there is this question of to what degree humanity has various kinds of psychological strategies to deal with certain problems, right? And then this is not just, again, mapped on. It's sort of bounced against the discourse. It's in a way read against the kinds of speeches that people make, the kind of language they're using to describe their own actions, right? And the attempt is to do as little violence to the other as possible. And my reading is intended to be sympathetic, not to the action, but to the feelings. How do we respond to these kinds of agonies?
Thank you. I have a question from the overflow room, and it's for Professor Ahmed. What differentiates state terrorism from oppression in domestic context and occupation, or war in the international context?
Are there some legal experts here? I cannot answer that question. But I can, when we look at the definitions of terrorism, and this is what almost creates reactions towards it, that we are always talking about groups that are rebelling or having insurgency against an occupying power. And we are focusing on the actions of those groups and almost trying to say, well, leave the occupying powers alone. And I think that's where the dichotomy comes in, that what happens to the actions of the occupying power? Are they also committing acts of terrorism? Because their actions are also killing innocent civilians. And somebody said, well, you have to discern intent. I said, you know what, I really, in my theological understanding, my frame of understanding, intent is only between a person and God. So I really cannot discern anybody's intent. And does it matter to the dead if you're killing them by intending to kill them or just inadvertently killing them? But if a certain military action you know by any reasonable parameter is going to lead to significant civilian deaths, then would that be considered terrorism? I do not know what the legal scholars would say, but at least from a very common person understanding, it appears to me as terrorism.
Yes, I explained this to my wife when I was working on financing of terrorism standard. And I said, well, if I kill you or threaten to kill you for your money, or in this case your insurance, that's not terrorism. But if I threaten to kill you to get the city to pave the road in front of our house, that is terrorism.
I'm just curious that if those suicide bombers and terrorist acting individuals get the chance to have military power, would they still commit these atrocities, or they will use the same power that the armies have?
I mean, I can just quote from a study that was done by Pape, and he talks about the suicide missions of Hamas and Hezbollah, and they describe their missions as martyrdom operations. And he says that, you know, this description of these suicide missions being martyrdom operations is not really based on any religious understanding. It is not, but it is simply not based on any religious tenets of Islam, but it is actually an attempt to pin an identity of altruism to their action in an effort to get more support from the population. And it does require support from the population to continue that action. So his contention is that although religion may play a role, the main motivation of projecting suicide missions as martyrdom operations is to cement the perception that these are justifiable responses to a specific circumstance of foreign occupation. And in Hezbollah's literature, they also go into talk about that they view these actions as necessary, quote, necessary, because of the military imbalance that they perceive between the occupying power and the occupied community. So that's how their language describes their actions.
Okay. Well, obviously I find Pape's analysis fascinating in certain in ways, but it doesn't, again, reflect the kind of discourse of the people who are using theological language. And this was addressed 25 years ago or something by Rappaport in Reich's book, The Origins of Terrorism. He says that one of the problems is that when you eliminate the ultimate cause of a particular group's actions, they often suffer tremendous anxiety and hostility because while there are political agendas, there are also fantasy agendas that involve various kinds of motives in terms of coalescing in order to extinguish various kinds of emotional and other hostilities. So take away the thing they're angry about, and in a way, you're taking away the focus for the hostility, which has to be redirected. Now, again, if we're only talking about a political strategy because there are, in fact, injustices, then maybe some people would stop. But others, one might suggest, and this is Rappaport's point, and he's, I think, a scholarly source, is that these agendas serve to evacuate tremendous amounts of hostility, and if they're displacements, then you're not going to stop them from violence.
I've heard the term or the adjective religious used many times this morning, and I'd like to have a definition of that. My question is, if during World War II a Japanese kamikaze pilot dove a plane into downtown Los Angeles, when would that be a religious act, and when would that not be a religious act?
Well, there was a lot of violence in World War II. I mean, among kamikazes and also Japanese soldiers that was perpetrated in the name of Buddhism, right? And that there were a number of Buddhist monks who were supporting that violence and claiming, not unlike the so-called terrorists and so forth, or not unlike St. Anselm of Canterbury, that violence enacted in the name of one's religion is really God's hand working through you. So you have people saying, it's not me, I'm not doing anything wrong, it's Buddha that's throwing the bomb. So there is that language. How much they believe it, I mean, it's hard to know. But
then the issue of how do we define religion is I have a handout I give my students, several pages long with lots of different definitions of religion. The point being, of course, like the definition of terrorism, however you define it then directs what you see and then obscures things that maybe you ought to be looking at but that you don't see because of that definition. Having said that, I think from the perspective of the concept of religious terrorism, is there what most of us would recognize as religious language in the way that the perpetrators of these acts, do they describe them in religious language? I think that, though, that part of the problem with that is that it's very hard to tease out from religious motivation, political motivation, or the idea of ethnic identity. I mean, these are all interrelated terms, and although in the United States we pretend like they shouldn't be together, I don't think we do a very good job of separating them either. But I don't see that idea that we could separate the religious, the political, the ideological, the ethnic, the economic, all of that. They're all interconnected. So it just makes that incredibly difficult.
And by the way, I mean, there are scholars now like J.C. Smith at the University of Chicago who are suggesting we stop using the term religion because it doesn't really explain very much when there's such disparate kinds of practices and ideas. If you're interested in the impact of religion on World War II in Japan, for instance, one could read Brian Victoria's book, Zen at War, or look up on the net a great article called Zen and the Art of Dive Bombing. It's really fascinating stuff.
Well, I mean, also when you look at the question of religion, is that how do you define religion? Religion as practiced by people, and then by what people? By the extreme of the group, or by the mainstream of the group? And or do you describe religion as something that is codified in sacred texts? And then those sacred texts themselves are open for interpretation. So I do see the point about this notion of looking for religious links behind terrorism is, and I don't want to spoil the entire conference, I do look at this as a futile effort, because there are no links. So we might as well stop and go home now.
I will just add my own one little experience. I once spent when I was in India, I once spent 3 hours discussing, arguing with a friend of mine. I won't say which particular religion it was, but it's probably not represented in this room, actually, and there was a big terrorist movement at the time. And one of the specific goals of the terrorist movement within this major religious faith absolutely was contradicted, clearly, purely, no debate about it, in the main sacred text. And I kept reading it to him in the language, I won't say which one, and said, how do you get it? And finally he pulled out his knife and showed it to me, and I said, okay. time for lunch.
Professor Ahmed, you were talking about the sacred texts as Muslims, Jews, and Christians. We struggle around interpretation of sacred texts. Professor Deal, could you give us a little insight? Are there sacred texts involved in Ohm's worldview and perhaps justification for their terror?
Yes and no. There is not a clear body, sort of canonical set of texts that Ashoka was relying on. You know, he was drawing stuff from all sorts of different traditions. I think the closest you get to something that is maybe a sacred text are his own writings or the words ascribed to him. But in that particular instance, no, it's not. It's just not that. It wasn't around long enough to be that organized, it seems to me. Yeah.
It seems, unless I'm misunderstanding, that when we talk about what we in the West refer to as suicide bombers, people in the Palestinian areas that participate in or support these behaviors refer to these folks as martyrs. And I'm wondering what it is about us that makes us want to romanticize suicide bombers by calling them suicide bombers. Why don't we call them homicidal martyrs? Why don't we describe them more accurately ourselves in a way that's consistent with how they describe themselves?
I think that's a good question. I mean, there are lots of terms that just seem to be really inadequate, but they're thrown around and, in fact, as Dr. Deal said, used as a euphemism, sometimes to evade various other kinds of moral implications. Some people call them suicide bombers, some call them homicide bombers. The languages we're using are inadequate, and part of, I think, what we're trying to do here is even draw attention to how inadequate the language is, right? And what might other insidious things that might be being acted out in even using that kind of language.
Yeah, part of the problem is language is also we see in the other context. We are now so tuned to seeing descriptions of terrorists as jihadists. And as I mentioned in my presentation, it has two problems. One, it is terrorism has nothing to do with jihad, and that's the title of my paper. It's terrorism is an unholy war. It's not a holy war, and jihad is not a holy war to begin with. So it's to describe terrorism as jihadist, it has two problems in it. One problem is that it ascribes a criminal behavior, it takes a criminal behavior and it elevates it to the realm of jihad, which in Islam, as I mentioned, has a very authentic textual underpinning as striving, as something that is that is enacted with a great deal of piety. Parents name their children jihad. Would you name your children holy war? It's not just Muslims. Arab Christians name their children jihad, or derivatives of jihad. Mujahid is also a very popular name in the Muslim world, not just the Arab world, but all across the Muslim world. So to equate terrorism with jihad, it takes a criminal act and it elevates them in the realm of Muslim understanding, actually emboldening the terrorists, because they now have greater stature among their own people, because they can project themselves not as committing terrorism, but as committing jihad, which gives them more currency. The second problem that it has is that it alienates the mainstream Muslim community. Because in the mainstream Muslim community, jihad is considered, again, as I mentioned, from a Quranic perspective, from a religious perspective, something that is very noble and something that is given a lot of emphasis and understanding. So it alienates the Muslim community by giving the perception, as I mentioned, that the war on terror is a war on Islam.
Thank you. I have a very quick question, and we only have about a minute and a half left, so I ask for very quick responses. It's a question I had, though, too. It's from the overflow room. What does thanatological mean? We know it's psychological and theological.
Thanatological. Thanatos is the Greek word for death.
For death.
So one of the foci of the paper was to understand the way death transforms, this kind of death transforms abjection into transcendence and so forth.
Great. Thank you.
Just wanted to make a couple of comments. I guess I'm coming from this from a slightly different aspect in that I was trained by our government for 4 years to basically be a terrorist. I was a graduate of the John F. Kennedy Center for Special Warfare. And terrorism, guerrilla warfare, conventional warfare, it's all one thing. It's just a different aspect of using force to achieve an end. And terrorism comes into play when you become relatively weak vis-a-vis your opponent. Conventional warfare is when you're relatively strong compared to your opponent. And it's really all just semantics. You can call it what you want, but terrorism becomes a small group trying to achieve its end against a larger or a perceived larger enemy. They don't perceive them. The use of suicide is probably also a bad word. I mean, they're willing to give their life for their cause. We say it's suicide, they say something else. I don't see it any differently than the kamikaze pilot, the American trooper falling on a grenade to save his comrades. It's all part of the same thing. And it's just a comment that I'm making from a different perspective.
If we could just have a very quick response, and then we'll continue this discussion informally outside.
No response other than to say, especially in terms of kamikaze, they certainly didn't see themselves as suicide pilots. They saw themselves as defending their nation. I think that's quite right.
Yeah, well, the same thing for the Palestinian bombers. They don't see themselves as committing suicide. They think they're doing something to save their nation from oppression.
Yeah, well, there were kamikaze pilots who would weep because they couldn't hurl themselves against their enemies for the emperor. And so what I would suggest is there are always deeper motives. Not sure what those motives are, but they're often complicated, and they, as I suggested, can contrast the stated purpose. And the purpose isn't always only strategic, and there are various fantasies involved, even if there are those strategies you were talking about.
Okay, thank you very, very much. Let's have if we could all reconvene back here exactly at 11:15.